Hello, everyone. Today we have Joe Polney, Developer Relations at the Algorand Foundation, to talk about TealScript, how he joined out the Algorand Foundation, and just to share a little bit about his side of his story. So, hello, Joe Polney. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's start this off by just telling us a little bit about your background. How you joined the Algorand Foundation and what you were doing before joining.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, so a little bit background about myself. So I studied computer engineering I think I graduated in 2020. So I studied computer engineering for 4 years. And during my studies, I was interning at a defense company, and that eventually turned into my full time position. So prior to joining the foundation, I was working at a defense company, doing like basically the complete opposite of blockchain. I was working with like embedded systems and doing some automation stuff there. And just in general, have always been very passionate about technology. Like even before it was my career, I was, on forums, modding games, doing all sorts of fun stuff, getting my hands dirty with software. So it's always been a passion of mine. And working at the defense industry, that's kind of where I learned a lot about software development and kind of like real world, what people actually need from software aside from just, making a mod or a game in my free time. And so I got a lot of experience there. And it was a really great job and I love the people I work with, but it wasn't like particularly fulfilling. Like it was very much a clock in at 9, clock out at 5, and anything between that, I didn't really think too much about it. And in my free time, I started getting into looking into different areas of software engineering, in particular, like AI, quantum computing, and blockchain were like the main things I was kind of interested in. And eventually that led me to Algorand. So the way I actually found Algorand was Charles Hoskinson was on Lex Friedman's podcast and he mentioned Algorand. And
Oh, interesting.
yeah, so that's because previously I was a big fan of Cardano, but that was before I really knew like the tech side. That I was just as like an investment. I thought Cardano was kind of cool,
Hmm.
and the main reason why was because I saw Cardano was doing some like real world applications. Like I think at the time it was some like education certificates in like Ethiopia or something like
Yeah.
that. But I eventually found Algorand, and the thing that stood out to me because at this time, like I'd been into blockchain for a while, like I knew about it. I honestly thought it was kind of just like magic internet money that didn't have much real world use case.
Like the most of us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then but in the what was it, 2021 bull run, that's when I started to get okay, like this thing's blowing up. I want to learn more about like the technology behind it. So I basically went to like all the chains I knew and just did a very quick like 5 minute looked at the developer docs to get like a vibe for what building on that chain would look like. And Algorand was the one that kind of stood out to me the most as like the easiest to comprehend. And I just really like the developer docs. Even just like the simple thing of like being able to click through all the different languages to do the same thing, I thought was really cool. So I ended up just kind of building on Algorand like in my free time. And the way I like to learn is I help other people. I feel like that's the best way to kind of learn anything. And that's why we have such a good team on DevRel is because
Mhm.
our job is to help people. So we've learned so much ourselves doing that. And so I was basically, before I even knew what DevRel was, I was basically doing DevRel on the
Yeah.
Discord where I was just, active in the Discord. Whenever someone had a question, I would try to answer it, even though if going into it, I know absolutely nothing about what they were asking. It was just a good way to A, learn, but also B, kind of get a feel for what people are actually building and like what sort of problems people have.
Yeah.
And so that was, I mean, time flies when you're in this industry. I think that must have been December of 2022, I think.
Mm. That's
Yeah.
already like
So
what, 2 years ago?
yeah. So that was like 2 years ago when I first really got into blockchain. And then this was around the same time that Stacy Warden
Mm.
came to the foundation. And there was an article and one of the various crypto like journalism websites about Stacy, and I read it, and she kind of just offhandedly mentioned that she wanted to expand the DevRel team because
Mm,
at the time the Inc. had a DevRel team,
right.
but the foundation there was one person doing DevRel, but it wasn't really like a team, and it wasn't like as much as what Stacy and what I think a lot of people wanted. So before there were even like open recs for the position, I emailed Ben or Barnji, as a lot of people knew him on the
Wow.
Discord, and Jason
Hmm.
Weathersby, who was our former boss, and they sent my resume to Stacy, and from there it's kind of just like a long process. It took a couple months for me to actually get hired. And the main reason was because I was really unsure if I wanted to make the move to blockchain because I had conversations with a couple different people from the foundation, and all of them were pretty candid about like this industry being kind of crazy and you never know
Oh
what to
yeah.
expect, which is like the exact opposite of defense, where I kind of knew what my
Mm,
career path would be for the next like couple of decades.
yeah.
And also like DevRel, well, like I said, like I didn't know what DevRel was before I joined the foundation. So
Hmm.
I wasn't entirely sure if it was like the right fit for me. But I ended up biting the bullet and joining the foundation. I had an interview with Stacy that went really well, and with Jason, of course, that went really well. And after meeting all the people here, and I felt like it was a good time to change my careers and follow what I was passionate about. Yeah, so that's the long-winded answer about how I ended up here.
Thanks for that. Well, I gotta give it to Stacy for hiring you because you are the biggest rock stars that the foundation have right now, and we're going to talk about later in this interview. But you're the one who started TealScript, right? Which is a TypeScript-like smart contract language on Algorand that makes it super easy to build. I'm personally a big fan of TealScript. I've been ever since it came out, I've just been writing smart contracts with TealScript, right? Until Puya comes out, and then I'll probably go back and forth. But we'll touch more on TealScript later. I actually wanted to touch on a couple of things that you mentioned while you were giving the answer. So you mentioned that back in 2021, was it? You were just like looking at various chains and seeing what it's like to build on these chains, and you've somehow decided that Algorand was the chain that you wanted to build on. Now, if you look back in 2021, I think that's when I was doing my internship at the Algorand Inc., now Algorand Technologies. I mean, the protocol was great, but in terms of like developer experience, like developer tooling and the smart contract languages, like it was nothing close to what it was like with Solidity with EVM chains like Ethereum.
Mhm.
So like I'm just curious, like what, because usually when people come into this industry and as a developer, they just default to Solidity, right? And building on
Right.
Ethereum. So I'm just curious, like why you kind of skip that process and just dive directly into Algorand.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like EVM was basically like a non-starter. Because like I said, like I always kind of viewed blockchain as just this like like a solution looking for a problem. And
Mm,
when I looked at like Ethereum, it didn't really make much sense, when you consider things like the cost of fees, reorgs, the relatively low throughput, like all these things that if you try to map it to the real world, there's like not a whole lot that really makes sense to be like fully decentralized on Ethereum.
hmm.
And so the chains I were looking at were chains that, like, the main criteria that I was looking at was like just like scalability. And what I thought, like what I could create a mental model for how this could map to the real world. So I was looking at chains like the main three I was actually looking at were probably Algorand, Cardano, and Stellar. And so those were the kind of the main contenders that I was really spending most of my time looking at. I did look at a couple other like smaller chains as well, but those were kind of the main three that I looked at. And as I looked kind of under the hood of those chains, that's ultimately what led me to Algorand, just looking at the underlying technology and just, well, a lot of it kind of just just like clicked with me.
Hmm.
And the like even stuff like the consensus mechanism, like it is like pure proof of stake. That's a really good name because it really is just so like pure. Like it
Yeah.
just makes sense. Obviously, like it's very complicated cryptography that I don't understand, but like the high level, it makes sense why it works and why it's decentralized and scalable. And so that to me is just like almost like the intuitiveness of the technology is what made sense to me versus, you look at and not to throw mud at other chains, but you look at like Solana, for example, where their nodes, they recommend like 256 gigs of RAM, and they say you should have like 512 just to be safe for the future. And that's going to continue growing as the state grows. And it's just like things like that, when you think about it in terms of like 5-10 years outlook, it just doesn't seem to really align with the blockchain ethos to me. And so that was really important to me, because at the time, like when I was looking at chains, I had zero idea of like me going to actually work for Chain Foundation. Like I thought maybe I would just start like a small side project that I could use, to buy a beer every once in a while, but never did I think it would be like my full-time job that I spent, so much time and energy and just like passion putting into. But that's where it ended
That's
up.
amazing. Like, I think it really draws the picture, right, of your journey. Like, you start from the defense industry, where it's more like real world problems based, and it's like more stable compared to. I mean, everything's stable compared to this industry, but and then like you became interested in AI, blockchain, and then because you're technical, you first looked at the protocols and like, I mean, how well it's designed, like in terms of scalability and also sustainability, right? Because these blockchains are not going to be going away in like 5 years. It's going to, ideally, it should be used forever. So
Mhm.
you need to consider like how fast the state storage is growing and that kind of stuff when you're designing a blockchain, which you kind of touched on while you were talking. And then so you decided Algorand because of his protocol superiority, but then you realize that the developer tooling and the developer experience is not the best. And I guess that kind of led you to build TealScript, right? I'm trying to put myself in your shoes to think, why would I, go ahead and build an entirely new high level smart contract language, just like that.
Yeah. So I mean, TealScript is kind of where I eventually led to, but there's kind of a lot of smaller things leading up to that. The first contribution I ever made to Algorand, the first PR I ever did to one of the repos, was in PyTeal. When you're writing in PyTeal, every time you want to use a number, you have to like wrap it in the int or
Yeah.
in the byte if you're using a string. And this was something to me, like, I understood why, but I also felt like as a developer, I could very easily picture the experience being the exact, like, or the functionality being the exact same, but the experience being I don't have to write int and byte every time.
Mm.
And so I think this was my first PR. It was like in December, way before I even had an idea of building anything like TealScript or joining the foundation or anything. But it was a change to PyTeal that basically made it so you didn't have to do that. And to this day, that PR is, I think it's gone stale. Like it was never merged. And the reason why is because, like, intuitively you think about it, like, oh, that's a simple change. Just finding the code where it expects an int and change it to also accept a Python number.
Right.
But the way that PyTeal was designed, it was actually like hundreds of lines of code that, like, I thought this was going to be a very simple PR, but it turned out into like hundreds of lines of code that had to change just because the way that PyTeal was designed. And to be clear, I don't think like PyTeal was poorly designed. I actually think it was really good at what it was built to do, which was generating teal. Like I don't think of PyTeal as a smart contract language, but as a language to generate teal. And it's really good at doing that. I think where the developer experience really started to get a lot of pain points is when Algorand capabilities started outgrowing what you could do with PyTeal. So like, because you have to remember, like, even like I joined right when I think I got into Algorand, like right when stateful smart contracts dropped. So like before that, it
Oh
was
yeah.
all just like logic sigs. And there
Yeah.
was no such things as like state or API or like any of that. You were,
Mhm.
I mean, writing a teal wasn't, even just in raw teal, wasn't that hard. And PyTeal was like a useful tool to build on
Mhm.
top of that. But as I got into more into developing smart contracts and, coming up with more complicated designs and talking to people that had more complicated designs, you started to see more cracks in the PyTeal developer experience where, again, it was kind of similar to like the int byte thing where like I could picture in my head, like I could picture writing a for loop in Python and having that turn into teal, but you can't do that in PyTeal. And so before teal scripts, I actually started on a language called TLRB,
Mm.
which was a Ruby-based language. And my approach to TLRB, which was different than TealScript, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but my approach to TLRB was I started with a teal and then just made it a little bit nicer to use.
Mm.
But starting with a teal as the base, like at the end of the day, it's still basically like assembly. Like it's not
Yeah.
a super compelling developer experience. And also with Ruby, like the VS Code experience isn't great. Like I had to pay for RubyMine to like develop TLRB, which is the JetBrains IDE, because it's just way better
Mhm.
than like running your own language server with VS Code.
Yeah.
And so I actually spent like probably like close to like 100 hours building TLRB. And I was like very confident in TLRB. But that kind of all changed. And this is what eventually led me to start working on TealScript, where in Decipher in Dubai, Fergal gave a talk on Tealish.
Yeah. I remember that.
And I saw that talk and I basically thought to myself that this is doing what I wanted to do with TLRB, but it's like better in pretty much every way.
Mm.
And so I felt like if I wanted to improve the developer experience in a significant way, in a way that Tealish wasn't, then I kind of needed to go back to the drawing board. And that's ultimately what led me to starting TealScript.
Nice. I was going to ask that question, but you just like naturally answered that. So, as a creator of TealScript, what makes you think? What about TealScript attracts developers? Like, as a developer, why would I find TealScript an attractive language to use to write Algorand smart contracts?
Yeah, I mean, well, first at like a high level, the reason I chose TealScript or TypeScript over any other language is because in this space right now, most people that are building are going to have some sort of like web component to their app, and thus they're going to be working with JavaScript or TypeScript. So TypeScript felt like it made the most sense. I went with TypeScript over JavaScript because you basically need types
Yep.
in order to write like efficient code in
Mhm.
such a like a constrained environment. So I chose TypeScript for that reason. And my, with TLRB, like I said, like my design principle started with, I'm going to take Teal and make it a better experience.
Mhm.
But my philosophy with TealScript was basically the exact opposite. And how I started TealScript was I wrote a TypeScript class, and then I kind of thought backwards, like, okay, I have this TypeScript class. It was probably just like a calculator or something.
Mhm.
And as a side note, I was doing this at like 4 a.m. Because it was like a massive time difference, jet lag. Like I couldn't sleep. So I was just like in my hotel bed on my laptop in the pitch
Mhm.
dark. And so I made like a simple calculator or something. And it was like a functioning TypeScript class. I was like, okay, I have this TypeScript code. How do I turn that into Teal?
Mm.
And that's kind of where I started from, where basically all the new features, all of the like design decisions started from the high level TypeScript, like what I want the TypeScript experience to be, and then work backwards to figure out how I can make this work. And what that allows is for it helps me, like, instead of trying to develop a product based on engineering constraints, I wanted to engineer a solution based on product constraints.
Mhm.
And one of the also helpful things with TealScript and why I think now like developers really like it is because I got a ton of developer feedback. Like, for example, one early adopter of TealScript was Greg from Vestige.
Mhm.
And he used it for his buildable submission, TameQuest. And he also used it for oranges. So like the initial oranges contract and now his new staking pool. And he was someone that had like no smart contract experience. Like he knew
Right.
Algorand, but he just didn't build smart contracts before. And he was a TypeScript
Mhm.
dev. And so he was able to give feedback about like how the product should be from the perspective of someone that, doesn't know Algorand smart contract development, is just like a Web 2 TypeScript dev. And that was really
Mhm.
useful. And because I started with a product, I was showing people in Discord and in person, like my idea for what TealScript should look like before it could even generate like a line of Teal. Like to me, I wanted to make sure that the experience was kind of like the leading factor in
Hmm.
how TealScript evolved. And because of that, it basically allows someone that, obviously there still is a lot of domain knowledge that you need to know about Algorand to like build a, actual dApp. But getting started, like writing a calculator, writing a hello world, it's the exact same code that you write for TypeScript. And it
Yep.
just eliminates that like translation layer that you have to do in your brain. Like, I have this idea, how do I translate to Algorand? How do I translate to like PyTeal?
Hmm.
And now you don't need to do that. You can just kind of quickly iterate. And actually saw Greg, he was on, I think it was on the Next Block when he was talking about it. And he says one of the reasons he likes TealScript is because you can like quickly iterate on it and the language doesn't get in your way of your thinking.
Oh
And I
yeah.
think that's like really useful. I know for at least me, like when I think about a solution, like in my head, I'm thinking about what the code looks like. And if the code is really verbose or not something you're familiar with, it's like trying to think in another language. Like
Hmm.
it's just much harder to do, and you have much lower productivity.
Yeah.
The developer experience is kind of the
Hmm.
my like beacon for where TealScript should go.
Yeah. I remember Greg reached out to me on Discord, and he was trying to learn PyTeal, because he wanted to build something, and I was helping him out, and then TealScript came out, and Greg was like, "I'm actually gonna ditch PyTeal, and then move on, and then go to TealScript." So I was like, "Okay, cool." And then he went on, and within like couple weeks, like he was building stuff with TealScript, and then like in a couple months, the Orange came out, right?
Hmm.
And like seeing people like Greg, being like empowered by this high level language, it really shows you the importance of an easy to use high level smart contract language, right?
Yep.
Because the interest was there, right? He wanted to build something on Algorand, but the sheer difficulty of learning the smart contract language and trying to get it to work often discourages people to actually build a successful product or an application. And that itself is proof that TealScript is an amazing smart contract language that will really help a lot of developers to build whatever they want, right? And hopefully
Hmm.
it ultimately helped the Algorand ecosystem grow.
Yep.
I also think that like the way you communicated with the community during the early development of TealScript, instead of like developing, behind the curtain by yourself, and then like once you thought it was ready, then share it with the world. No, you were out there just actively asking questions, asking for feedback, sharing your opinions, even before, like you said, it could generate a single line of Teal code, right? And I really
Hmm.
think that's the power of open sourcing and getting people involved, because they're the ones who are going to be using this language, and they're the ones who know what's best for the language, right? And
Yep.
as a developer of the language, those kind of feedback is very much appreciated. So obviously you built this amazing high level smart contract language called TealScript, but how important do you think it is to have such a language for developer adoption, right? Because we're DevRel, right? Our job is to help developers and help them, like, give them technical support, but it's also our role to convince people or inspire developers to build on the Algorand blockchain and tell them, this is a great blockchain to build on. So, how important do you think TealScript playing? How important of a role is TealScript playing in developer adoption?
Yeah, I mean, I think high level languages in general is really important and just good developer experience, kind of for two reasons. So one is like kind of what you just mentioned, with Greg, where like someone has an idea and they can just like easily throw together the code and like see stuff happen. I think that is really important. And like,
Hmm.
as I mentioned, like coming from, I was someone that was like really into modding games, and that was how I kind of got into software engineering. And there's this term like script kiddie, where it's basically like you don't really know how like things work, but you're able to download a script and like hack a game because it's just so easy to do. And
Ah.
so I think like empowering the script kiddies, empowering like the young teenagers that
Hmm.
just want to see stuff happen, making it as easy as possible for that stuff to happen. Like, for example, I'm sure there's a lot of people that are in software development now that their first experience seeing code was like right click inspect and changing a line of JavaScript or HTML to make the website say something funny or something like that, right?
Oh
Like
yeah, of
it's
course.
having that like super like low barrier of entry, I think is really important. And
Hmm.
then also I think like going from blockchain, it's a pretty big shift in like the underlying technology. And I think going like trying to shift both the technology, like as a developer, trying to use new technology and learn a completely new language for that technology is really hard. Now,
Mm,
obviously, in some cases it makes sense. And in like there's some stuff that you can do in JavaScript that will just never be translated to Algorand. It's just, it would be too computationally expensive. But the idea is that like the vibe, the essence of the developer experience is still the same. And I think this is like really crucial for getting people to adopt new technology. And I think a really good example of this is like CPU architectures. Like you look at like ARM versus x86 and you know Windows, like there's been some Windows laptops that have had ARM before Apple Silicon, before the M1 Max, but they
mhm,
got basically no traction because in order to develop for them, like none of the old code was backwards compatible. You had to develop completely new apps specifically for that, and it
right.
just it never really caught on. And you could go to people on the street and tell them how amazing ARM is over x86, like the efficiency and like all these things that makes ARM better. But at the end of the day, if it's not easy for developers to work with it, then it's not going to see adoption.
Hmm.
But then Apple came along, and one of the reasons Apple was able to do this is because they, to be fair, they do have a very like tight like walled garden ecosystem where they have their own language like Swift.
Yeah.
But the people that were in that ecosystem, if you knew Swift for x86, you knew Swift for ARM, and a lot of apps were fairly trivial to port, or they provided like Rosetta, which allowed even x86 apps to run on ARM. And then
Hmm.
you see like, I mean, now I think it's hard to recommend like an x86 laptop over like a M1 Air because it's just so compelling of a product because of the underlying technology.
Hmm.
And so I think like it's really important to make that transition as easy as possible for developers, because when that transition is easy for developers, it means that they can build products that users actually care about. And ultimately it's the products that's going to drive people to using blockchain. It's not like, right now most people that use blockchain, they know what a secret key is, they know what a public key is, they manage their own private keys, they have a ledger. But I don't think that's what mass adoption looks like. I mean, how many
Hmm.
people manually manage their like HTTPS certificates? Like
Right.
nobody, right? And so I think the future of this technology is abstracting away the blockchain specific stuff and just focusing on the products. And the way you get there is by making it as easy as possible to build compelling products and having a good developer experience for building those like real world scalable solutions.
I really like the part where you talked about porting, right? When you're porting one code into something, and that transition needs to be easy and familiar. If a developer is coming to build on the Algorand blockchain, they're either going to be coming from Solidity world, which is about like 90% of the developer in the blockchain industry right now, or from a non-blockchain developer, right? And and I remember when TealScript first came out, I had to learn it because I had to teach it to people. And I tried learning it by porting a Solidity AMM app, a DeFi
Mm.
smart contract, over to TealScript. And I've never worked with TealScript before. I never read a single line of documentation on TealScript before that. And I was just trying to learn it on the fly. And I was able to successfully compile the TealScript AMM app in under 4 hours. Like it was that easy, right? And the reason why it was so easy was because it's just TypeScript code at the end of the day.
Mm.
And there were some, specific niche stuff that you had to kind of dig through the documentation to figure out. But even that, like it wasn't, verbose code. It was very intuitive and it made sense, right? And the IntelliSense just is so great that oftentimes I didn't even have to look at the documentation. I just looked at IntelliSense and looked at what it was recommending, and I just looked at, okay, this seems like it's going to do what I want it to do, and it does, right?
Mhm.
And oftentimes that's not the case. Like you assume that this is how it will work, but it's actually entirely different, and that's when like the confusion and the difficulty comes in. But I've never had that problem when building with TealScript. And like you said, that's why TealScript is such a powerful smart contract language that will help in developer acquisition and adoption for the Algorand ecosystem. So I want to ask you, in your opinion, if I'm a Solidity developer, I've been building with Solidity for 4 years. I'm pretty proficient in writing smart contracts in the EVM world, right? But I want to kind of expand my skill sets. I want to look at some non-EVM chains, and I land on Algorand, and I see this language called TealScript. How hard would it be to kind of make that transition? Like they already have a set of Solidity smart contract written. Like how hard would it be for them to kind of migrate those code over to TealScript? And I guess like the reason why I'm asking this question is because if there's anyone listening who's a Solidity developer, they're probably wondering, you know, will I need to spend like weeks and weeks trying to learn this new language and this new environment to bring this smart contract I have over to Algorand? Or
Mhm.
will it be like a simple process? Because if they know that ahead of time, it's just much easier to start that process. So I just want to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, so for a little bit, like looking under the hood of both. So Solidity is based, the design principles are based on ECMAScript, which
Mm,
is basically like the underlying like syntax that both JavaScript and TypeScript follow. So Solidity is already pretty close to TypeScript, like just as a language. There are differences between vanilla ECMAScript and TypeScript and Solidity, but kind of the overall, like the way you work with like arrays and the way you do like for loops and while loops and like the way you call methods, like those are all pretty similar. So going from Solidity to TealScript is a fairly simple process because like the core of the language, like they're both ECMAScript based. So the core of the language is the same. And there's a lot of like principles that exist. Like in Solidity, you have mappings. In TealScript, you have a box map. So there are
mhm,
like differences, but there's almost always like a one-to-one correlation. And really, I would say really the only area that is like significantly different between going from Solidity to TealScript is that assets on Algorand are like native assets.
mhm.
So they're actually like much easier to work with because you don't have to interact with a contract as like in TealScript. If you want to send an asset, you do send asset transfer. But for the most part, like everything else is pretty much, there's almost always a one-to-one corollary for how you do something in TypeScript or how you do something in Solidity to how you do it in TealScript. And in general, you should kind of feel as a Solidity dev pretty at home with the syntax of TealScript because it's both ECMAScript.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. I think the advantage that Solidity developers have is that they're already familiar with what a smart contract is, what smart contracts are for. So they already know like the structure of what a smart contract should look like. And what I really like about TealScript is that this, I mean, for Solidity, it's contract, but for TealScript, it's like a TypeScript class. But the structure of it is almost identical. You define the states at the top, and then you define the functions. You can have some internal functions, like for Solidity, that's public or private functions. Here over in TealScript, that's it's like external API methods or subroutines, right? Have different names, but it's basically the same thing. So I agree with you. I think Solidity devs should definitely give TealScript a try, and I really think they'll be pleasantly surprised by how intuitive it will be for them to migrate their ideas or their smart contracts over to Algorand. Now, there's the other side of story where if I'm a non-blockchain developer, right? I've been in the software space for 10 plus years, but I never worked with blockchain. But I hear this blockchain is this very cool thing that you can do with it. I'm interested in learning. Now, if they were to come to Algorand and look at TealScript, what should their approach be? right? Because they have no concept of what a blockchain is, what a smart contract is, how you need to interact with these smart contracts, what these smart contracts are for. Like these kind of blockchain specific concepts they're not aware of. Do you think TealScript also kind of help these non-blockchain developers get familiar with those concepts?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think, as a new to blockchain, like you can, like, for example, when you do an aggregate init and choose TailScript, it
Mm,
gives you a calculator app. And it's a TailScript contract, but if you copy and paste that code into like a TypeScript file and then you execute it, it works like you expect a TypeScript file to work. So the initial experience, like how you get your feet wet, it's the exact same as TypeScript. And
mm,
generally, what will happen is you might, like, as a developer, you're going to think of these features that you want to implement, and you can just start writing the TypeScript code of how you would implement it in TypeScript. Now, because you're working on a smart contract, you're going to find out, where those limitations are and what TypeScript doesn't support and where you're going to run out of opcode budget. But I think it's really powerful that the limitations you hit aren't the language itself, but the environment in which you're coding.
yeah.
And I would say it's actually very similar. So my background, I studied computer engineering, which is it's different from computer science in the sense that I didn't take so many classes on like high level like design and algorithms. I more so spent time like doing electrical engineering and like
Mm,
designing circuits and like working with CPUs directly. And so, and in defense, I worked with like embedded systems, which is, work very low level code, like writing bio software and stuff. And so in that case, when you're working with embedded software, you have, a couple kilobytes of memory. You have like no disk space. You have very limited CPU cycles. You need to get, and like in my job, we did like sensor processing. And so like if a missile is coming at the plane, the pilot needs to know as soon as possible. So
right.
we gotta, get our timings right. And
Yeah.
so I was using like C, for example, to write this code, but and so that was easy. Like I learned C in high school, but this was a new environment, and I had to kind of learn the constraints of the environment as I went along. But the fact that the environment was what was constraining me and not the language basically made it like almost like a playground that I could play in.
Mhm.
And I could figure out for myself where those limitations are rather than struggling with the language to even reach those limitations. Like
Mhm.
if you're working with like PyTeal, for example, you probably are going to keep your app very simple because it's really annoying to write like complex things, like writing like iterating over an array, for example, in PyTeal and like appending stuff to it is really complicated. But as a developer, like iterating over array, you do dot for each and you get all the elements. And you can do that in TealScript. And not having those limitations means, yeah, you're gonna hit the barriers of the AVM quicker than if you were using a low level language. But hitting those barriers is how you learn about that environment and how
Mm.
you can really understand like what your constraints are and help shape like the overall architecture of whatever it is you're building.
I actually really like what you said there. We often think that having complete freedom to do whatever we want is will help you be more creative. But oftentimes in a creative process, when you have limitations or restrictions, certain restrictions, it really allows you to be more creative, right? Because you know the environment that you're working in. And because you limit the scope of what you're thinking, you think in a way of, okay, this environment doesn't allow this, but I want to do this. Now, how do I make that happen? Now, that thought process cannot happen when there is no limitation, right? And I think that's one of the biggest strong suits of AVM as well. I was talking to one of the core developers who built the AVM when I was at Algorand Technologies, and they were saying how because Algorand started later than Ethereum came around, 2014, and Algorand launched in 2019. So they had the chance to kind of witness what was happening with EVM, what the problem was with the EVM, and they tried to kind of put those constraints on the AVM level to kind of remove that problem. And I guess like one example would be reentrancy. Like reentrancy is just not possible on Algorand because the AVM prevents it, right? So even if I write bad code that allows reentrancy on an Algorand smart contract, that just can't happen. And so I agree with you on, having a limited environment is really helpful for a developer. And like you said, for the language that you're writing in to not be an obstacle of that is key. And as a non-blockchain developer, I guess like learning by breaking things is the best way to learn, right? Instead of trying to take like I don't know, like 3 month academy on the blockchain basics, because you don't really have to be a blockchain expert, like the protocol expert, to build stuff on the blockchain, right? As long as you know what it enables and you're fairly proficient with the smart contract language, then you can really just get started right away. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that a lot of developers have, is that, oh, like building blockchain applications is too hard, like I don't know anything about blockchain. But that's fine, like as long as they know the tooling on top of the protocol, then they can get started. And I think TealScript really allows these non-blockchain developers to do that. Yeah, so TealScript came out around like 3 months ago. Was it 4 months ago?
Well, it's hard to really say. I mean, like I said, like I was getting TealScript in front of people before it could generate a lot
Right.
of teal.
Hmm.
I guess I would say like the start of TealScript was when we did our first boot camp with TealScript.
Oh
And
yeah.
I want to say that was actually May last year.
May?
So yeah,
Seriously?
yeah.
Oh
So
my gosh,
it's
time
been
flies.
it's been in the hands of developers
Wow.
for a couple months now.
Mhm. Mhm.
And yeah, throughout that time, we've gotten a ton of really useful feedback. Like
Yeah.
a lot of useful feedback on the like experience side of things like Greg just like looking at a contract and saying that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But now I think it's really when, like, for example, Patrick from Transaction Labs or NF Domains,
Mhm.
he's starting to build some contracts using TealScript. And
Nice.
Patrick, like that dude knows the AVM, like he
Oh
knows
yeah.
those limitations,
Probably
and
knows
he's
more than
able
I
to.
do.
Yeah, I mean he's been in Algorand like forever, and
Oh yeah. He's a
he really
legend.
understands what the AVM can do, and so
Mhm.
he's writing TailScript contracts that are really pushing it to its limits, like doing
Mm.
like he's the reason that TailScript now supports for each, because
Mm.
he had an array that he needed to iterate over, and doing like a regular for loop wasn't efficient enough. So
Mm.
we needed to come up with a way to efficiently iterate over an array, and that made sense to implement as for each. And so now as we start to see these more like expert builders and these people building these much more like complicated designs that really push the AVM to its limits, I
Mhm.
think is when it starts to get really exciting. And in particular, because like for anyone that's in the Discord, you've seen the amount of releases that TScript
Yeah.
has had, and a lot of those are because of bugs that Patrick finds.
Mhm.
But like the amount of bugs he's been finding has been getting less and less, and I'm pretty sure now he's like onto like deploying the contract and like end-to-end testing.
Mm.
So it's really exciting seeing, we're talking about TealScript in Discord before it generated a lot of teal, and now going to a place where, people that know the AVM really well can really like leverage teal to its fullest extent. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's been really exciting.
So let's touch on that a bit more. So TealScript is an open source language, right? So anyone can contribute to it. So how can developers contribute to TealScript if they want to? And are there any issues that you want developers to kind of jump on first?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and unfortunately, I don't have a really great answer for.
Mm.
So, for some context, TealScript started, like I said, like it started at 4 a.m. in Dubai, just as like a side project,
Mm-hmm.
and I've been essentially like the sole contributor to it so far, and that's really great because it allows me to iterate super quickly because I don't have a
Right.
team that I have to make sure that this change won't affect what they're doing. I don't have to
Yeah.
like make sure we fit to our design doc. Like I'm going fast and breaking stuff,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is not sustainable long term, but it's helped get TealScript to where it is today. So even like the external documentation for TealScript isn't that great, and it's a weak point, but it's even like worse internally. And honestly, I would even say like a lot of the code in the TealScript compiler itself, for example, is just straight up like bad code. So if you want to contribute to it, it is open source, and you're more than welcome to, anyone can look in the TailScript code and find areas that they want to, even just like refactors, simple stuff like that. But it is a little bit hard to approach. And that is, so, and this year we're also going to be thinking about how we can integrate TailScript into like the Puya stack, and in general, just making TailScript basically like productionizing it a little bit more, making it easier to contribute. So, but right now, if you really want to help contribute to TailScript, and by the way, as a side note, I should mention, like, when we talk about open source, a lot of people view contribute as like actually writing code and PRing, but there are like many different ways to contribute. Like I mentioned, like Greg and Patrick, all the feedback, like I would consider them TailScript contributors,
Of course.
even though they haven't written lines of code. So even if you're just like a TailScript user that doesn't have interest in like contributing to the compiler, come to the Discord. In general, you can just ask questions there. But we also have a weekly meeting for TailScript where basically every week we get on a call. It's myself, Steve, who's in DevRel, and Alessandro, who's our head of product, and whoever else can kind of join from the community and from the foundation. And I basically just go over what changed in TailScript in the past week and what's planned, like what are the high priority items, what's been moved to the back burner. And so that's really the best way to kind of stay up to date in TailScript development itself. And so that is, I think right now it's 11:30 a.m. Eastern every Monday. And then we also post a video and a ChatGPT summary of what we talked about in the Discord channel. So if you can't make it live, you can still kind of see what's going on. And again, of course, you can, at any time, you can always just post in the TailScript Discord for support, questions, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I've attended one of those meetings last week, and it really is the best way to stay up to date on what's happening with TailScript. So you mentioned TailScript being added to the Puya stack. Now, Puya is our big push that the Algorand Foundation is doing. Last year and this year, we're launching Algo 2.0 in hopefully late March or sometimes in Q1. And that's going to bring native Python to Algorand, meaning you'll be able to write Algorand smart contracts with native Python. I think when I'm talking to developers, I realize that there seems to be some confusion around, okay, so what is the smart contract language for Algorand, right? Because when it comes to Ethereum, it's just like Solidity. And then there's Viper, but like most people just use Solidity, right? There's like this defined language. But Algorand, recently, we've been having so many new smart contract languages, right? We've had Tealish from Fergal, which is a community language, which is a great language. So if people want to write in that, they can. And then we had PyTeal, and now we have TealScript and also Puya Pi, which is Python.
And C# as well.
Right, and C#, right? So we have these smart contract languages coming. So I guess, how should developers decide what smart contract language to build on, right? Does each smart contract language have like its own limitations, or should it just be based on whatever language you are comfortable with? Like, what should they consider when deciding what language to build on?
Yeah, so long term, it should just, whatever language that you like, right? It's like asking, what language should I write my backend server in? Like you could use Node or you can use JavaScript with Express. You can go Python with like Django. You can use like Phoenix with Elixir. You could use Golang. Like, which one is best? Like, yeah, they all have their pros and cons, but especially in the context of like you're a startup, you want to build your MVP, just choose whatever language you can develop fast on. To be clear, that's kind of like the long-term answer. That's kind of the goal of where we're getting to right now, because all of these languages, and so I'll be talking about C#. When I say all the languages, I'm just talking about like the AlgoKit languages, which right now is TailScript, C# and Puya. Not to discredit like Tealish or anything anyone else has done. I'm just not as familiar with the development with them. Right now, between those three languages, there's pros and cons between all of them. And like, for example, looking at Puya, it's basically two products of one. You have the language that developers actually interact with, but the other like deliverable of Puya is the technology behind it, that if in the future somebody else, whether that's the foundation or just another developer, wants to write their own high-level language for, let's say they wanted to write Rust, they would they could use Rust to plug into the Puya stack, and the Puya stack would take care of a lot of like the low level AVM stuff that needs to happen. And so the goals of all these different languages are a little bit different. And so they're all, the primary goal is to make the developer experience like seamless.
Right.
But those intermediate goals kind of shapes what the experience is like right now. Like if you're a developer right now, the main difference is what those intermediate goals are. So for example, like on TealScript, my main goal was the developer experience in the front end of using TypeScript to write smart contracts. So I'd say TealScript right now is probably, relative to Puya, probably a little bit easier to approach for someone that doesn't yet know Algorand. Where Puya, on the other hand, it has like really solid tech. Like for those that don't know, the Puya stack and also AlgoKit, it's being developed by a software engineering team, MakerX, and they're like world-class engineers, like really smart guys. And they've been the ones that have not only building like the Puya front end, but the underlying technology. So Puya has super solid tech underneath it, but it's a little rough around the edges on like the front end stuff. So what it looks like to actually write Python. And again, I want to be clear that this is just right now as a developer. And as we're recording this, Puya hasn't even been officially released yet.
Right.
So that's, to be expected. But long term, the goal is for Puya to have a super compelling dev experience that Python developers can copy and paste code and have it work just like they can with TypeScript. So for short term, I would say Puya is a little bit better suited to if you're an Algorand developer that's like maybe you've already written PyTeal or you understand the AVM. Puya will be, and to be very clear, Puya is like 1,000x improvement over PyTeal. But there's still some areas where you have to think about like ABI encoding and decoding. That might be harder for someone that doesn't know what the ABI is. And again, like that'll change long term. It'll be Python, JavaScript, or C#. Which one do you like better? But short term, because of the differences in what the teams are really delivering, the experience is a little bit different. But like if you're just starting right now with a new project, I don't think you can really go wrong with any language, between C#, Puya, and Python, because by the time you're ready for production, all these languages are going to be super solid, tightly integrated into AlgoKit and just provide like a really good developer experience.
Definitely. Lastly, I think this is my last question of today. What's the best way to learn TealScript and get started? Any plans for boot camps or tutorials, courses in the future?
Yeah. So right now, the best resource is we have a existing boot camp on YouTube, or you can go to our github.com/algorand-devrel, and that contains a link to our bootcamp repos. That is the best kind of comprehensive resource right now. But I will say that because TealScript has been developing so quickly, some stuff in that bootcamp is going to be either deprecated currently, so it no longer works, or going to be changed in the very near future. So to address that, in March, we're going to be having a beginner bootcamp for TealScript. And so that will be the best resource for TealScript. And then outside of the boot camps, we'll also, one of the goals, so TealScript is currently version 0. So that means there's a lot of breaking changes. The documentation might be out of date. The goal is TealScript 1.0, ideally end of this month, maybe early March. And by that time, that the TealScript documentation will be really good as well. And so if you want to get to the documentation, probably the easiest way to get to it in a way that won't change in the future is github.com/Algorand Foundation/TealScript. That's like the repo for TealScript. And then in the repo, there's a link to the documentation. And that has not only like actual like API documentation, like what each function does, but also it has like guides. So it helps developers like, how do I think about blockchain when I'm writing in TealScript? And also like step-by-step tutorials that'll kind of show you, starting with AlgoKit and init, how do I actually build an app? So that'll all be there by the time we get to the boot camps and 1.0 releases. The documentation for TealScript will be a great place to go as well.
Amazing. Yes. And I'll leave a link to all of these references down in the description of this video. So you can definitely go and check them out. But Joe, thank you so much for making the time to do this today. I've always wanted to do this with you because I was curious on the backstory of TealScript and how it came to be. And why not just do it on a call and record them and post it on video? All right. So thank you, Joe. Hopefully, for those of you watching, check out TealScript. It's an amazing smart contract language. And if you want to contribute or just ask questions, join our Discord channel. The link will be in the description as well, and Joe will be on there, and you'll be able to directly communicate with Joe and talk about TealScript. So thank you, everyone. Hope to see you in the next one.